Hey everybody, Smart Silver Stacker here. I hope you're doing well. Boy, 2023 does certainly seem to be getting weirder by the day, doesn't it? And we are only in February, so who knows what this year is going to bring over the coming months. But in today's video, I want to go ahead and put on our silver foil hats here briefly, and we're going to talk about some of these unidentified flying objects that have been spotted over North America, that have been shot down recently over North America. And I do want to cover some of the theories that are floating around out there regarding these objects. And yes, some of these theories do actually have at least some tangential tie-in to silver. So, be patient with me on this one. We will be getting to that one shortly. And today's video is brought to you by SD Bullion, my preferred source for physical gold and silver bullion. You can check them out with the link down in the description. Now, briefly, let's go over what has happened so far, just to get us up to speed. Well, first of all, we had the Chinese spy balloon that transited the U.S. This thing supposedly, about the size of 3 buses, had the ability to steer itself a bit. It was spotted kind of loitering over some sensitive areas in Montana, areas where the United States has ballistic missile silos. And then ultimately, after transiting the entire continental United States, this thing was shot down off of the Carolina coast, and there are recovery efforts ongoing to get the debris that was remaining from this craft after it was shot down. And then, more recently, we had an unidentified object shot down over Alaska. And then the next day, we had one shot down over the Yukon. Apparently, Trudeau and Biden got on a call, talked about shooting this thing down. And these were a little bit different, these objects that were shot down over Alaska and Yukon, at least according to the data that we are receiving. Supposedly, these things did not have the ability to steer themselves at all, which that spy balloon supposedly did have at least some capacity for directing itself. Saying these things are a little bit smaller, they're the size of a car instead of 3 buses, and they were flying at around 40,000 feet. And so, again, the powers that be, the officials, are saying that these things were a threat to commercial aircraft possibly at that altitude. Now, also, in other news, recently we had this strange thing with this Chinese satellite deploying green lasers over Hawaii. Now, I guess it's not that unusual for satellites to make terrestrial measurements using lasers, but the weird thing about this one was that these were visible green lasers, and so obviously somewhat disconcerting to those on the ground who saw this. And in related developments last night, the FAA closed airspace over Montana. They were citing a radar anomaly as the reason for that closure of the airspace. And then today, to make this whole thing even weirder, there are reports that the Chinese may have detected an object flying over their port city of Qingdao. So, who knows? Is this an obfuscation by them? Are there objects all over the planet? I mean, it's hard to say what's going on. We don't have a lot of information at this time, but there is a lot of speculation going on as to what these things might mean. Now, I do just want to go ahead and preface this video by saying, I'm not advocating for any of these theories. I'm still withholding judgment until we get more data, but I think it will be kind of a fun and interesting mental exercise to briefly entertain some of these theories and notions, just to kind of examine them in depth. And I want to go over some of the more standout theories. And, just for YouTube's sake, I'm not presenting this as a fact. I'm not trying to spread any disinformation. This is all just speculation. So pretty please, YouTube, don't cancel me. Don't censor this video. Now, that being said, yesterday, I did put out a question on my YouTube community page asking all the channel subscribers what they thought were going on with these objects. So before I get into some of the theories and cover them in more detail, I do just want to go over some of the comments that all of you left, because there were some good ones. One was this comment: before you attack an adversary, you must test their defenses and response. And I think that, yeah, that's probably a pretty insightful comment. There's certainly a possibility that some of these objects could be probing U.S. defenses, gauging what we might do to potentially hostile objects that are flying over our airspace. Here's another response that I thought was interesting. What an inexpensive way to mess with the air defenses of NORAD. Jumping at shadows will be the new norm. I would like to know why they wait until they are over land before shooting them down. So for the first part of that comment, yeah, I suppose that, I don't know what these balloons cost, but probably less than a Sidewinder missile. And so I guess you do get some ROI in terms of, just harassing U.S. air defenses with these things possibly. And as far as, waiting until they're over land before shooting them down, well, I know that one of the things they were saying in the press conferences regarding these objects in Canada and Alaska is that the fact that they're over territorial waters, but that the waters are frozen at the moment, meaning a solid surface beneath these objects, should make recovery efforts easier. So that might be some part of the motivation. And then, of course, we don't really know how soon they are detecting these things or how many of them are being detected. We're kind of just at the mercy of the Defense Department and the current administration as to how much information about these things is actually being released, and it's precious little so far. So hopefully more information will be forthcoming soon. Now, here's another comment that said, scare the American public into giving up more of their freedom. Oh, governments, fool us once, shame on you. Fool us twice, shame on us. Yeah, I suppose this could be some kind of a false flag thing, these additional objects. Again, we just don't really have enough information to make those judgments. I know some folks out there are speculating that perhaps this is the precursor to an alien invasion, or maybe a false alien invasion. I mean, that's one of the more out there theories, but who knows? And then, yeah, we got the third secret of Fatima is aliens, and Magic Eyes Only on YouTube is Majestic 12 disclosure. Those were two comments we received, and I did say we were going to be putting our foil hats on today, so I suppose we can take a look at those comments too, although I don't know how much weight I would put on those things. Here's another one, an added excuse to add support for World War III. And yeah, this could be potentially just getting us whipped up for further conflict. I mean, the amount of media attention that these things are getting could be a sign of that. And someone else wrote, they're cheaper than satellites. And I think that absolutely could have something to do with these things. I know I've seen a lot of people on Twitter and across the webs commenting that, why use these things at all, balloons or flying objects, when you have satellites? Well, I think that cost does play into that to some extent, and possibly also the detectability of these things. They may be harder to spot or harder to keep track of than satellites. And there also may be things that you can do from the altitude that these things operate at that you can't do from space. For example, if you want to sprinkle some pathogens or something along those lines down onto the surface. I mean, I'm not saying that's what's happening, but there are things that balloons and flying objects of this type might be able to do beyond what a satellite would be capable of. And then here's one of those comments I was mentioning just a moment ago. DARPA drones to lube us up for alien invasion psyop. Now, I suppose that could be. I hope that this person is wrong. I would say that these are, certainly fringe ideas, but if there's anything that we've learned from this decade so far, I think it's that truth is probably stranger than fiction, and we can't really rule out anything completely at this point. So I do appreciate everyone who responded to that question that I posted up on the community tab. You can go post your own theories over there. But that being said, let's begin our examination of these events with perhaps a bit more mundane theory, and that is that this could just be kind of a psyop, something, a PR move on the part of the current administration, because I think we all know the president has been taking a lot of flack over the delay in shooting that original spy balloon down. It's kind of odd to me how heavily politicized this thing has become. I'm not trying to cut Biden any undue slack, but I do think it was the Pentagon and the military who advised him to delay shooting that thing down in the first place. And according to what we've been told, the military was at least able to degrade the spy balloon's ability to gain intelligence somehow. I'm assuming that's through some form of jamming or electronic warfare. But nonetheless, the president has been taking a lot of flack over letting this thing transit the entire continental U.S. before shooting it down. So maybe these additional objects are just kind of a ruse, something that they're creating to try to make up for that initial criticism by now ordering these objects to be shot down before they transit the country, to kind of, save some face and to show that the president can make that call to shoot things down. So that's one possibility. And I will say, again, that a factor that kind of stands out and makes me think that this is at least possible is simply the amount of media attention that these objects are receiving, because we're getting just frontline headlines across all the mainstream media outlets. There's press conferences being held regularly about these things. So who knows? I mean, that could also just be because the story's kind of juicy and it gets traffic, or it could be a little bit beyond that. Now, the second possibility I will say here is also pretty mundane, but perhaps a little bit more nefarious, and that is maybe there's something else going on at the moment that the powers that be don't want us to pay attention to. So these objects, these UFOs, this could just be some misdirection, kind of a look over here thing, not over here. Notably, there is this story about the chemical spill that occurred in Ohio a couple days ago. A train carrying vinyl chloride was derailed, and in order to prevent an explosion, the authorities set fire to this vinyl chloride to burn it off. And when vinyl chloride burns, this is some pretty nasty toxic stuff. It created a cloud of phosgene gas, which is like a deadly gas that was actually used in World War I as part of chemical warfare. And seeing lots of reports of animals being killed as a result of this cloud. All the people within, a large vicinity had to be evacuated, and this did create this giant billowing cloud of black toxic smoke. Now, at this point, the EPA is telling people they can go back. I would be a little circumspect before I did that myself. This stuff is pretty carcinogenic, I believe, and eventually I guess it'll be diluted in the atmosphere, but, this can't be good for the environment or for the people in that region. So, at least for folks who live in that area, that story is probably a lot more impactful than these objects, but the flying objects seem to be getting a lot more attention than that. So I don't know, that could be possible. It could be possible that this story is just a red herring, kind of an obfuscation, and certainly the way that it's being blasted all over the headlines with the press conferences and whatnot, seems possible there could be an element of that as well. But unfortunately, really, I think that those theories, those ideas would probably be a best case scenario if this was just kind of a nothing burger and a bit of a distraction. But let's speculate a little bit more and let's talk about what could be possibly the worst case scenario. That would probably be if these crafts are a vector for some sort of an offensive attack, like, say, an EMP. Balloons of the type, at least that first transited the US, that spy balloon, they have the capacity to carry a pretty heavy payload, something like a ton. And that is certainly enough to carry an EMP device or a low-yield nuclear weapon, something along those lines. And at the altitude that these things operate, that could create an EMP over a pretty large area if such a device was detonated at that altitude. So, I'm not sure about these other two that have been shot down. They're reportedly much smaller, so I'm not sure if they can carry a payload for something along those lines, but we just don't have enough information yet. But if these things are relatively cheap to produce and to launch, and if they're difficult to detect, then this kind of an attack, while perhaps not being the most likely explanation, I think it is something that we should at least be aware of. And, when you think about EMP attacks, that's an attack on the grid. And, we seem to have a hard enough time keeping the grid up here in the US when we get bad weather. So I would say that there is a vulnerability there. And depending on the scale of such an attack, there could be all sorts of widespread negative consequences. You got to have your beans, bullets, and band-aids ready, of course, your other preparations, not just your financial preparations, because, if that's what's going on here, this could get extremely serious, and it could have some terrible consequences for those of us living in the U.S. But, I know I always get a lot of comments when I talk about these kind of preparedness-related things about how you can't eat silver and it's not going to do you any good. And yeah, like I said, you do have to have your other preps in place, but I think that the vulnerability of our almost entirely digital financial system is also something that we need to be aware of and be preparing for. How much digital wealth is there out there? It's probably the vast majority of assets that are held these days. Of course, you've got your, physical, tangible stuff, your precious metals, you've got your real estate, but your stocks, your bonds, your fiat currency, all that stuff is stored and tracked in digital systems. So, how vulnerable is that to an EMP? Well, hugely, I would expect. And let's say the grid goes down, even temporarily. Well, what does that mean? It means banks are going to close, payment systems will cease to function, food delivery could be interrupted. And even if it's just a regional thing, you got to keep in mind that we have a very fragile system in place here. And even in the best of times, we've got things like Bank of America reporting funds disappearing because of glitches with the Zelle system. We've got stocks being halted and trading because of glitches on the New York Stock Exchange. So, what if you get a real disruption to the system? And let's say it's a regional attack, an EMP, but let's say it hits a major financial center. Well, it'd be disastrous for the state of the economy. And that is why I think it is imperative, as part of one's preps, to have some physical wealth that is stored outside of the digital financial system. And that could mean cash. Sure, you want to have some of that on hand, but really just keep in mind that that's just paper at the end of the day. You probably want to have some for convenience, but I think for long-term storage of wealth, physical metal that you take into your possession is where it is at. And maybe you're a little skeptical about precious metals. I don't know. If you just want to store cash, maybe it would make sense to get some US nickel coins. Today's metal prices, nickels are worth something like 136% of their face value. So if you've got some room to store them, it might make sense to have a couple $100 boxes of nickels stacked up. I prefer silver personally, but If you want something that's maybe a little less speculative in some ways, you can get as many nickels as you want at the bank for way less than their melt value. And that could be an option as well for storing some cash outside of the system, but not in a paper form. Now, let's say that these objects have nothing to do with an EMP attack. That's, of course, just speculation on my part. But let's say that they are hostile in some capacity. Well, regardless of what that capacity might be, that means that this World War III thing could be on the verge of kicking off in a very big way soon, or at least moving towards a significant escalation. And it might be in ways that we've never witnessed before. We've got the World Economic Forum recently warning of a massive cyber attack that's looming. In their 2023 cybersecurity threat assessment, they conducted a poll of businesses and cybersecurity leaders, and 91% of those respondents said that they felt that a major cyber attack was at least possible within the next 2 years. So, to me, that is just more reasons to have wealth outside of the system. As we see this global conflict escalating, we don't know what turn it might take, but it is getting weird. I mean, we're talking about unidentified objects being shot down in U.S. airspace. So I wouldn't dismiss this as just being some kind of kooky UFO thing. I mean, this is potentially a real sign that things are about to get nasty. So, have some cash, have some gold and silver, get your basic preps squared away. I don't know how this thing is going to play out, and who knows? Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it is really just grandstanding by the media. Maybe it's a big distraction. But it could also be the harbinger of something very disruptive. And a channel that's been following this story very closely and doing some great reporting on it is S2 Underground. Some folks in the comments actually turned me on to that. And in a video that he recently put out, he pointed out that the last time that the U.S. shot down a hostile aircraft over U.S. territory was at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And the next day, the U.S. was fully engaged in World War II. So, this development, as bizarre as it is, I really don't think it's something to just brush off. Now, I know that this video is not really in the normal silver stacking vein, but I thought it was just too bizarre and interesting not to comment on. So I hope you enjoyed this video today, something a little bit different from the norm. Thanks for watching, everybody. Do me a favor and leave a comment down below to let us know what you think these objects could be, what they might mean. And that being said, everybody, stay safe and happy stacking. Hope you have a great weekend. Smart Silver Stacker, out.